I am a 20-year-old male. I live in the lower half of Oklahoma, about an hour away from Oklahoma City. I work at a fast food restaurant with a very high turnover rates. So needless to say, I've met and talked to several interesting and odd people we've hired. However, I've always been very personable and love getting to know people by asking them questions they may not normally be asked. One day, Jesse and I were both off and began talking about the supernatural, and how even though I'm a skeptic, I still love hearing people's stories. When out of nowhere, he gets really serious. His face goes slightly pale, and he says, "I have a story." By his sudden change in mood, I could tell he was serious. He was usually such a bubbly guy. Jesse said it happened like this. One day, Jesse and his friend, let's call him Phil, were skipping school, as rambunctious kids do, in the same area we now work in. Phil's father owned several properties, but had one in particular that was never really used much. It was a plot of land with maybe around 30 acres, mostly just spares trees and grass. But the thing about this property was that it had a house on it, one of those old, maybe 50s or 60s houses that looked like the people had just up and left one day with no reason or belongings. They just left being bored and not of anything else to do in real Oklahoma. They thought it would be a good idea to go explore. It was about 3 in the afternoon, in a bright and sunny day, traveling down the dirt road to the house. Arriving there shortly, they got out of their truck and walked the path leading to the house, moving the gate as they answered. The house itself was a 2-story old country-style house with a big porch and a somewhat sizable living room. As it seemed, they both walked up the creaky porch, each step letting out a crackly sound as they moved. Phil decided to go explore the inside, while Jesse elected to explore the outside and porch. Phil went inside, leaving the barely hinged door open, while Jesse looked around. Exploring the porch, he found nothing of interest, so hopped off the porch and began walking around the side. As he did, he said he began to hear some sort of heavy breathing and heavy footsteps. Thinking it was only Phil, Jesse continued around the house. Now halfway around the large house, when he suddenly heard the loudest shrieking sound he'd ever heard. He froze. Phil's father never used this land, let alone for livestock. Why would there be a goat out here? Before Jesse could move, a figure slowly walked from around the corner. It was tall, 6'8" or taller, and very lean and buff, he said. He nervously looked up at its head only to find a more off-putting sight. A goat's head sat on top of a muscular torso, looming down on him and very obviously looking at him. Jesse snapped out of it and bolted back towards the path they came from, screaming the whole way. Phil, hearing this, ran out of the house yelling, What is it?" when he too must have noticed the figure, now closer to the porch, just staring at him. Phil took off to catching up to Jesse, passing and tripping Jesse. No joke, tripping Jesse in hopes of a better chance of survival maybe. Jesse, shaken but not hurt, got back up to continue running, but not before one last look back at that house. All he saw was the goat man, now standing in front of the house, just watching them leave, motionless. They both got to the truck fine, Jesse rightly ticked off by being tripped by his friend, and they hightailed it out of there. The moral of the story: don't trespass on Goat Man's property, and if you do, make sure you're faster than your so-called friends. I deliver for a local pizza chain in southern Ohio. It's in a rather small city with lots of farmland and heavily wooded roads. So you can imagine I have seen a few odd and unexplainable things while driving around during the night. I have seen strange orange lights in the sky. I shine from animals peeking out from storm drains. Something that looked to be the tail of a large reptile disappearing off the side of the road. A strange green orb hover above some trees. However, the creepiest and most unnerving experience I've had happened late one night while I was driving down one of those long wooded roads, having to use my brights because there are no street lights for several miles, when I got a strange feeling that I wasn't alone this time. I started to look around and noticed something to my left in the trees. There was a pair of bright red glowing eyes about 5 or 6 feet above the ground, staring right at me. I immediately slowed down to do a double take, and then another and another, as these eyes watched me slowly drive by. My heart and mind were racing as I began trying to make sense of the situation. Maybe it was a mailbox reflector, but there were no houses there. Or maybe brake lights on a car, but that did not make sense either, since there was nothing there but trees. I even went as far as thinking maybe someone had hung something in the trees as a joke. But they were gone when I came back. Once I had passed, and I could no longer see whatever it was that was watching me, I began looking for road signs to use as markers for when I returned back down the road after I had delivered the pizza. Well, on my way back down the road, I drove carefully and slowly looking for the spot of my encounter. I started to slow down as soon as I saw the road signs and began to scan the tree line with the camera on my phone, ready to snap a picture of anything I saw. But there was nothing there. It was gone. Ever since that night, I've been up and down that road countless times, and I've never seen those eyes again or anything else in that spot. I thought it must have been an animal of some kind, if nothing else. But when I did some minor research into different animals who have eyes that glow red, there were none living in the area. I have asked around and believe it was most likely the Mothman, but I have no idea why it would reveal itself to me. I may never know. I still frequent this Eerie road as well as many others on my routes. I will be getting a dash cam because most of the time when I'm on these roads, I feel as if I'm being watched, and I would love to catch something on camera to have as proof, other than just my word. This happened a few years ago. I was staying at my sister's house in rural Oregon. She lived right by a big forested hillside. While I stayed at her house, I usually slept with the windows open because she had lots of pets and I have pet allergies. I'm a cat lover though, so the cat would usually sleep in my room regardless. My room was on the second story of the house, with the windows facing towards the hillside. The hillside was roughly 50 yards in the actual house with a small field in between. So one night, at around 1 a.m., I was up on my laptop playing some Warcraft, when the cat jumped onto the windowsill and started growling and hissing. Then I heard a very large thing start crashing through the brush on the hillside at a running pace. It was running down the hill. The noise was getting louder. Every time I got to the bottom, though, it would run back up. This went on for about 10 minutes. Then it would reach the bottom another time. I heard what sounded like some kind of animal squealing in pain. It was ear-piercingly loud, and at that point the cat saw growling and ran out of my room, and I just sat there with my face pressed on the screen on my window, trying to see whatever that thing was. I could hear the bones snapping on whatever I was eating. Then I heard it exit the brush and stepped into the field. This thing was so big that I could feel the vibrations from its feet hitting the ground from the second story of the house. And while it was still about 40 yards away, I still couldn't see in the darkness, though, so I went to find a flashlight. When I found it and shine it out there, all I saw was this thing on all fours. It was still pushing about 5 feet tall. It had a pale, gray, blood-covered skin and a bear-like face. But with gaping eyes, it was staring right at me. I snored his teeth and made a growl, and I thought it was going to climb up the fire escape ladder and kill me. I was frozen in fear, just staring at this thing as it took a few more steps forward. All of a sudden, the cat came rushing back into the room and back to my windowsill and growled back at this thing. It glared the cap for a moment and then retreated to the hillside, crashing through brush again on his way back up. I followed with my flashlight and saw a pair of glowing eyes once it got to the top, as if it stopped to look back. Then, they disappeared. I closed my windows, shut the blinds, and tried getting some sleep. I had nightmares about the beast. The next day, I asked my sister and her husband if they had heard or saw anything the night before, and they didn't. I have no idea what that thing could have been, but the fact that I could feel the footsteps made it all too real. I apologize for its length, but I needed to tell this since no one believes me. This summer I had several encounters with mysterious creatures, some really terrifying. This past summer I worked at a Boy Scout camp, and there had been rumors of spirits patrolling the nature trail on the far side of the camp. One night after work, me and two other co-workers, Steve and Jim, decided to walk the trail at midnight. We were about halfway through the trail when Jim told us to stop, and we listened. It sounded like something was gnawing on bones and tearing flesh. We shone our flashlights to see the remains of a deer, but the rib cage was torn open, almost flattened. The deer's entrails were scattered across the fourth floor, and the skull was crushed, and we could still hear the noises. Steve told us that we should get the fuck out of here, but we pressed on deeper into the forest. Suddenly, Jim stopped in front of us, and I asked him what's up, and he just pointed his light forward. About 20 yards away, we saw this thing. It crouched with its back behind us, tearing into what we believed was a piece of the deer. It stopped and slowly rose, standing almost 10 feet, and it dropped whatever it was eating and turned around. Its face was nothing but a skull, but no human skull. It looked like a deer skull. Its arms were long and lanky, ending in large claws. Jim screamed, "Holy fuck!" As we began to run, the creature let out a horrifying screech, and I made the mistake of turning around. The beast went on all fours and charged at us, breaking smaller trees and stumps as it ran at us. We continued to run as we got off the trail and stopped as we got into the pool building. As we collected ourselves again, I could hear something outside. When I looked outside, this creature was standing under a light post, breathing slowly. It destroyed the light above it with one swipe of its clawed hands, before disappearing back into the darkness. The next encounter was a couple of days later, when it was me and two other lifeguards, Colin and Maya. They were sitting in the office as a thunderstorm ravaged the camp. We watched the rain when a flash of lightning showed us something, standing on the other side of the pool fence. Maya shrieked as the beast disappeared, where it looked like it walked towards the lake. I followed the beast into the pouring rain, where I unfortunately lost it. The next morning, we found that the geese that lived near the lake were torn to shreds, and it took us an hour to clean up the entire mess. The next encounter was the next to last week of camp, and this was honestly the most terrifying experience. It was a Wednesday night, and I traveled the nature trail alone, and then I heard it. Something was laughing at me, and it sounded like it was close to me. I turned and saw the biggest creature I ever saw. It stood about 10 feet and had a deer skull for a head with massive bloody antlers. It began to trace me as I ran the trail. I could hear that the brush behind me was crushed, and the beast was breathing heavily. It felt like hours, but it was only a few minutes till I figured I lost it. After I stopped to catch my breath, I could feel my backpack being torn, and when I turned, I saw it. I then locked myself in the pool office, and I was terrified when I heard it ram the door. When it stopped, I could hear someone's voice, and through the crack, I could see it skulk around the building, and I never saw it again that night. The final encounter was the last. It was during the last week when each night I saw the creature lumber through the parking lot. It looked like it had something in its grasp as it tore into it. I ran back to my campsite, and as I laid on my sleeping bag, I heard footsteps trudging through the campsite. When I looked up, I saw its blood-covered snout poke its head through the tent flaps. Its red eyes casted an eerie glow inside the tent, and I could hear it breathe, and what I thought was laughter. Each night, it returned and stuck its head in various tents until one staff member woke up and screamed. The next day we couldn't find him and spent the day looking for him until we found him in the parking lot. He looked pale and told us that it grabbed him and took him to the old BB range, and when it left, he ran that night. Me and 3 other people took flashlights and went to explore the range. It was decrepit, and vines grew all over it. And then we saw them. Several carcasses of deer strewn about the place in various stages of decay, and they appeared to be partially consumed. One guard screamed as the window rose from behind the rock wall in front of the range and charged at us. We ran back to the science building, and we watched as it came out in the light. This one had blue eyes and was extremely thin, and it had 3 long fingers, ending in claws, and it scraped the ground and sniffed the air until it slowly returned to the forest. That was the last encounter I had, though I plan on returning to find it again. This happened when I was 12 years old. I used to have this little electric mini bike that went about 20 or so miles per hour and had a small little light on the front of it, so I could see in the dark. I used it to get to my friend's house and back. On one particular summer night, I drove over to a friend's house on my mini bike at around 5 or 6 p.m. to play with him on his Xbox 360. I believe we play Call of Duty 4 or World War. I'm not sure which one we played. All I know is that I stayed there till around 9 at night, and since my parents were easygoing parents and we lived about 2 miles away, they didn't mind that I stayed home late. When I went outside of my friend's house after I say goodbye to him, I went to go on my mini bike to drive back home. Keep in mind, the whole way there, around his house of mine too, are largely wooded areas, so we would always hear creatures moving around and always hear crickets when I hopped on my bike, and I happened to notice I didn't hear anything at all. Not even any crickets, it was just silence. This was a very odd, because we always hear them, and there are thousands of them in the woods. There was something that made them quiet. Take note that the mini bike was electric and didn't make much sound when it accelerated. Since it was summer, and pretty early in the summer, around mid-July, it was still pretty light out at 9 p.m. Not too light, but enough to make out someone's face from about 10 to 15 yards away. As I started heading home, I felt very uneasy, as if I was being watched, and I still heard nothing of the crickets. I was coming up at a T-junction, where I would have to turn left to continue down the road for about a half mile, and make another left at an intersection and going down straight until my house came up. As I was approaching the T-junction, I could barely make out something in the tree straight ahead of me. I saw a pair of eyes in the trees. My first instinct was thinking it was maybe an owl or something, because we got quite a few owls up here where we live, until I saw I had blood-red eyes. When I got closer, I could tell whatever the fuck that thing was not an owl, and his eyes were 9 feet off the ground. Before I go on, I must say there's a legend around where I lived at night. Sasquatch would come out and hunt, which was obvious, or so I thought. Bullshit. I never believed in Bigfoot cryptids, but when I saw these eyes and how far off the ground they were, I immediately thought of this legend. I pissed my pants when I saw this because I was a very paranoid person at the time and still am, and would always assume the worst. I was terrified and knew that I would have to make this T-junction very fast and book it the fuck home. When I turned left, I was going as fast as I could on that mini bike. I lost sight of the eyes and thought thing had just ran off, until I heard the woods, but whatever this thing was easily keeping pace with me. I started crying at this point and kept just driving as fast as I could down the road. I started approaching the intersection when the tree stopped, and there would be a bit of a clearing on all sides of it, and saw 9 and a 2-foot, tall, hairy, disgusting-looking bees come out of the freaking woods. It was coming straight for me. I made the left as fast as I could, and I'm not sure if it was a miracle, but I saw a pair of headlights coming down the road. I turned behind me and saw the beast step into the woods because it would be illuminated by this person's headlights. As soon as I passed the person, I heard the crickets again, and hoped that this beast would just leave me alone. When I got home, I shut the garage door, locked every door, window in the house, and my mom saw me obviously uneasy and pale and asked what was wrong. I never told her, or anyone for that matter. Not up until now. I don't know what the thing was. Possibly a Sasquatch, but whatever it was, I hope I never see it again. I've since moved into a dorm at my college and settled visit my parents, who still live where they did when I was 12. I hope no one ever has to endure the fear that I felt that night. This is a true account of something strange that happened to me and two friends one summer in the early 2000s. It happened in the town that I grew up in, with one of the friends being a lifelong friend from childhood and the other a college friend of his. We had gone to different schools, and being home for the summer, we were just having a lot of fun partying and whatnot. This particular night, I got together with my friend James and his friend Mark. It was a hot night, and we decided to jump the fence to our own town pool and go swimming. We had done this a dozen times before and have never had any trouble and only ever needed to keep an eye out on local cops. We got there, hopped the fence and stargaze on top of the canopies, and then we went swimming. We weren't that loud as we didn't want to attract any attention of any cops through looking for kids. About an hour into being there, all of us in the pool, we heard a low grumble come from the woods that surrounded the pool on three sides. It rose quickly, intensity and volume, with a rapid Doppler effect that came towards us from deep in the woods. It sounded like a pack of very angry dogs or wolves or something, all roaring ever louder, like talking over one another. We all froze at the beginning of it and just stared into the woods at the direction of the sound. It came so fast, charging to the tree line and the chain link fence that surrounds the pool grounds. I've never been so frightened in my life. The thing I can remember clearly was there were no sounds of footballs, whatever it was, moved to the woods at such a rapid speed, but no discernible thumps or branches being crushed underfoot or branches or anything being moved. The awful roaring reached a crescendo just as it broke the tree line and got to the fence. Or so our ears told us, because we couldn't see anything there. We all remained frozen in the pool, just staring and waiting for our death. I really don't know how long we stayed motionless in the pool staring, but the sound stopped abruptly when it got to the end of the grounds. It was such an awful, heart-chilling sound. It made her bum run cold on a hot summer night. After God knows how long, we all snapped out of it and got out of the pool. We hauled ourselves out, grabbed her clothes and ran dripping wet and jumped the fence and took off. Now, the thing is, this is the suburbs, only about 20 minutes outside of New York City, so there are no bears, no wolves, and I've never seen a dog without a master, much less a pack of wild dogs out there. This was one of the most frightening moments of my life. I have no idea what it was. I actually completely forgot about the incident to a few years ago when my friend James brought it up, and the entire thing came flooding back at once. The only thing I can compare the sound to is one on a Bigfoot documentary, where I saw a man who said that he heard one mimic the sound of this. That's the closest I've heard, being that it is the suburbs outside a very densely packed city, and knowing the size of the woods, I find it near impossible for it to be that. These woods are not large enough at all to sustain something like that. It's bordered by schools, businesses, and houses. So I don't really know what it was after all this time. I asked my friend about it again 2 Christmases ago, and he said he thought it was aliens. I haven't spoken to Mark, as he was more of my friend's friend, but I'm now curious what he thinks after all this time. My best friend and I were around 9 years old at the time. One day she calls me and asks if I want to go intertubing with her and her mom. It wasn't actual intertubing. Her mom went to the store and bought some floaties and dropped us off at the national park about 10 minutes away from where we live. Yes, you read that right. Her mom dropped two 9-year-olds off at a national park in the middle of the woods. Turns out, my friend only said her mom was coming, so my parents would let me go. Anyways, the plan was intertube down this river, which LED into town. Then walk to her dad's house and call her mom to pick us up. The trip goes all right. Some parts of the river were shallow, so we'd have to stand up and walk through the river, holding our inner tubes until it got deep enough to float again. It was super fun and relaxing being all alone in the wilderness, just enjoying each other in the water. The only part that freaked me out at this point was the fact that there was no trespassing signs posted on a few trees on our way down the river. The river we were on was close to the road that led to the national park. That was to our left. To the right was wilderness that stretched on for miles and miles. We get to a point that we're deeper than the rest, I'd say about 10 feet, or laughing and joking around, when all of a sudden we hear rustling to our right. We couldn't see much. The bank was overgrown with ferns, or some other type of foliage that grew way taller than either of us, even taller than the height of a full-grown man. All the blood drains in my face, and we are both paralyzed in fear as we watch as tall, human-like figure on 2 feet holding its arms out like a raptor does and passes through the foliage. We couldn't see, it just the shadow of it, of course. I'm on the side closer to whatever the freak this creature is. Two thoughts went through my head as this was happening, but I didn't dare make a sound. It was a person. I thought about the no trespassing signs, and I was terrified that I was going to have to sit here and beg for my life to some crazy outback Haley hunter or something. That's when I noticed that I could see the outline of a definite fur all over its body. The next thought, it could be a bear. This scared me even more, because animals like this have no sense of wrong or right. At least if it was a person, I have a chance to beg for my life and possibly be successful in doing so. A bear would just rip the both of us apart and wouldn't see anything wrong with it, or just lunch. A few minutes pass, still complete silence. I look over to my friend, still on edge, very uneasy, but I manage to whisper and ask her if she wants to get out of the water and walk the rest of the way. She, of course, replies yes. We paddle ourselves to the water with our arms and make it to the bank towards the road. It was about 5 to 10 minute walk up the steep hill, but oh well. It was better than staying down there and risk seeing that goddamn creature again. We walked into. Eventually her mom pulls up and says that she had the feeling to come checking us because we haven't called yet. It wasn't until after that we realized it definitely wasn't a person. It was covered in fur. I don't think it was a bear. It walked on 2 legs perfectly and actually ran. By the way, we ended up doing this in the same area twice after this. Once a few months after this happened, however, but nothing happened again. Where I work, there is an attic. No, not a creepy little lit dirty attic. The attic at my work is large, well-lit, clean in a bright white. There is heavy metal racking that is empty, a good part of the year, and we have still grids on them. They are heavy enough to hold over a ton, but still loose enough that if you ran on them, they would make noise. Now, the attic has its fair share of awkward moments that I could write about, including, at one point, a poltergeist. But this is not the story I'm sharing. I'm not just limited to the attic, but it's an important factor, so here it goes. This happened a few months ago, and it was after closing time, the first time it happened. I had to go into the courtyard to put up signs for the next day. The courtyard has a heavy metal ceiling about 2 stories up, mind you. As I walked to the first automatic door, it opened. Well, before the sensor would pick me up on it, and I just stood there. Something in my head said not to go there, as a wave of unease hit me. It didn't feel like the paranormal feels I usually get, and that made me a bit nervous, so I chose to walk the extra yard to the other door. It was closer to where I need to put the sign in the dim light yard. As I got to the door, it, like the other door, opened well before I got near it. I felt like there was something that I couldn't see. It closed, and I cleared my thoughts and went to the courtyard. I had to put the signs out if I wanted to go home, and it was late. I went out there, and I felt like I was being watched from the ceiling as I walked. I could hear something was moving in the high metal beams. It honestly sounded like talons against the beams. And I looked up and saw nothing, no birds, no figures, no shadows, just pure white beams with nothing on it. I put the last sign up, and I could hear something still following me from above. I began to quicken my pace to the door, and suddenly, I heard the shipper of heavy boxes a few feet behind me make noise like something massive had fallen on it. I looked at the shipper, and indeed there was a huge indent that wasn't there before. I moved quickly, but not running to the door. As I walked back to where my co-workers waited for me to leave, I heard the doors open behind me, but there was nothing there. The next day, I had chosen to push the strange incident from my mind and try to shake it off as some sort of unusual daydream or something. The day went on like normal for the first few hours, but I had to run some of the things up to the attic, choosing to take the elevator for easier transfer. I remember hearing the same metal claws combo as I began to head upstairs, as if it was following me in the underbelly of the attic stairs. It legitimately paused when I looked towards the sound and resumed when I started walking again. I decided to keep focused and not dwell on it. I've learned dwelling on something seems to make it more interested in you, no matter what it is. I went upstairs and started sorting items. I heard something come from up the stairs, but I saw nothing there. I honestly remember feeling like something was perched on one of the beams near me. It was like if I really wanted to see it, I would, like whatever it was really wanted me to. It was a strange feeling of tug-of-war in my own mind. I told myself to ignore it. Always there was this feeling I just couldn't. It wasn't my own. It was screaming at me saying, "See me," but I ignored it. My whole body felt like it was itching to run, but I knew I couldn't. I walked back to the elevator and, I shit you not, the partisan visibly moved. It was like something large was running along the heavy metal shelves. The rack was actually moving like something large and invisible was following me. When I got into the elevator, I heard it hit the wooden ground in front of it. The elevator shifted. I stood there, focused on the doors, but I knew that it was in there with me. I felt like it was hovering near me, waiting for me to freak out and look at it instead for some unknown reason. To this day, I can't explain. I reached for where I felt like it was without looking. I tried to touch whatever it was, and I'm not joking. It felt like the elevator shifted, like something large had backed away suddenly and hit the wall as the doors opened. I walked out quickly, and since then, I have not heard or felt anything, and I've said nothing to any of my coworkers. Unfortunately, I don't think it's gone. Since then, there has been a ridiculous amount of injuries upstairs that no one can figure out. I myself got my hand nearly broken by the beams that fell at random. Another coworker said he felt like he tripped over something large that he couldn't see and had fallen down. So, is this some sort of invisible cryptid or maybe something paranormal? I've seen quite a few things that I have a hard time explaining. My father served in the military, was descended from a Native American tribe from up north, was a survivalist and a complete sociopath that forced his sons into intense survival scenarios and then left us for weeks on end to see if we'd survive. I've seen some truly disturbing things during these cramping trips, and some things in less stressful settings. Anyways, I'll get on with the sighting. I was 11. I had just moved back to America less than a week before. My family had decided to take a short road trip up to Maine to visit some family when we went off course, being 11 and naive enough to think that I would actually make it to Maine before my father. Did anything stupid. I didn't pay attention to when he pulled off onto a back road. To this day, I do not know where I was dropped off at, just that it was in a dense, forested area. I think it was in New York, but I can't say for certain. I was kicked out of the car, handed my canteen, my bow, my compass, and my quiver. I was told that they'd be back after visiting family, and I'd have 15 days out here. I did the basic survival stuff. Found drinkable water, built shelter, plotted out a rough map of the area in my head, and all of that stuff. It was my third or fourth night there when I heard what sounded like a woman screaming. Since mountain lions didn't come out this far east, and bears were easy to scare away if it was one, I figured that I'd go investigate. In case that it was an injured hiker or something. After following the sound, all that I could find was a squirrel that was partially eaten. Since the screaming had stopped, I figured that someone had been hiking and came across those, but had left their calming down. So I went back to my shelter and settled in for the night. After that, though, the screaming became a nightly occurrence, and after the third night of not finding anything aside from evidence of a predator in the area, I decided to play it safe and stay in my shelter at night. 2 days before my family would pick me up where I was, I woke up in the middle of the night to screaming right outside my shelter. I jumped out with bone hand, my knife and arrow in the other. What I saw terrified me. It was about the size of a dog, but shaped like a deer, had a very humanoid face, and was covered in dark scales. I panicked and shot in the chest. It began hissing and wheezing as it ran off into the trees. I had thought about following it and killing it, but then I looked at his tracks. I saw something that convinced me otherwise. The creature's hind legs left behind the tracks of a small deer. The front legs, however, you see a person walking on their hands like a gorilla. Only the fingers ended with sharp claws, marks scratching up the earth while it moved. I didn't sleep at all for the rest of the night, and on the following morning, I dug several holes around my camp, filled them with sharpened stakes, and covered them. I also did my squirrel hunting and harvested berries as fast as I could once my defenses were up, so that I wouldn't need to worry about losing my strength if that thing came back. It didn't that night. Not that I got any sleep anyway. In the morning, I just carved a simple warning into the trees around my camp that said danger traps, and left. I didn't let go of my bow until after I was picked up, and we have been driving for an hour. I honestly don't know what I saw, or if the light had been playing tricks on me. I just know that I heard a screaming sound, and that I know what I saw in the creature's tracks. Well, to begin, I get my Native American blood from my mother's side. Her mother was a full-blooded Chippewa, although they didn't talk much about it, so I sought out elders when I was in my early 20s. When I was about 12 years old, my mom and dad got divorced, and we moved to Florida, where my mother's half-sisters lived. While visiting my Aunt Caroline, who lived in a little town called Osprey, 15 miles outside of Sarasota, which is on the western coast of Florida, South Tampa, is where I saw a skunk ape. My mom and aunt were talking, so I decided to walk through the nature because I love it. I headed for a wooded area. I had to cross a cow pasture to get to the woods. About halfway across the pasture is when I saw this hairy man. It was standing next to a palmetto bush, just staring at me. That is all I remember, because the next thing I know, I'm walking on the street in front of my mom's house. I never told anyone until years later. Again, in my 20s at my dad's house in Michigan, there was a summer of strange events. Something was breathing outside my window, so loud it woke me up out of a sound sleep. My stepmother confided in me that she saw a tall, hairy man run across the backyard at night. My dad had 2 different events where something was making a high-pitched noise and slapped against the side of the trailer. My uncle, who lived across the street, said one night he heard what sounded like a grown man wrestling in the woods behind the house. During this time, one of my elders had asked my dad if he had a couple of friends who could build a sweat lodge on the 15 acres that my dad owns. My dad said yes. So they came out to do the ceremony, It was a year later, and they hadn't built the lodge, so I went to the elders and asked if something was wrong. One of them said it just didn't feel right. I decided to tell them about my weird experiences, which had stopped after they did the ceremony on my dad's land. They all said that it was Unchi, which meant Bigfoot. They explained, he shows up when things are out of balance to remind people to live in a good way, to restore balance later. I learned about putting down tobacco when entering the woods in their territory and asking permission to pass through. It is said that they will guide you and protect you, and although you will not know they are there usually. The Bigfoot is also known as Kitty Sabe, and is taught that they brought honesty to the people. I'm a 15-year-old female from Victoria, Australia. I live around half an hour from Geelong, which is around 1 hour from Melbourne. My area is what is considered the country. I also have a large reserve only about a block from my house. This story takes place around 2 weeks ago. I was home alone on a Saturday night. My mother was with my father in Melbourne for a business trip, and my sister was with her boyfriend and will be home later. I was in the lounge room watching Netflix when I heard a thunk from the front veranda. It was too early for my sister to be home, so I thought it was the neighbor's dog. He can sometimes jump to the fence and come looking for food or something to play with. I went to the front door and looked through the window to the side. It was not the dog. There was a tall figure, maybe 210 centimeters tall, which is about 7 feet for Americans. I had goat's legs covered in gray fur with black hooves and bright yellow eyes, which looked right back at me. I ran back to the living room in blind panic. What the fuck was that? I thought. In a random idea, I grabbed my phone and started playing the loudest song I could find, which happened to be Hero by Jonathan Young. This wasn't an attempt to either scare or lure the beast away. And I heard the window smash behind me. I ran to the kitchen to grab something to protect myself, which ended up being a cleaver. This thing started thudding around the hall towards the room I was in. It was probably 30 seconds, but it felt like hours. Waiting for that thing to finally appear. Finally. I spotted his glowing eyes in the darkness and ran at it swinging. I felt my knife stabbing to something, and I pushed it deeper. And twisting, the creature screamed to pay and pull back, running away and jumping back out the window. I spent the next 3 hours locked in my room with 2 knives and a torch next to me. When my sister came home, she asked what was wrong, but I just stuttered. Wind, window, goat stab, over and over. My sister came out with me and looked around and found a large hoofprint in the hall and in the yard. We stayed together the entire night. I still heard the clacking of its feet every night just outside my window, probably looking to hurt me. In any way it can. Hasn't come back for a few days, and I'm hoping that I don't see it again. Well, to begin, I get my Native American blood from my mother's side. Her mother was a full-blooded Chippewa, although they didn't talk much about it, so I sought out elders when I was in my early 20s. When I was about 12 years old, my mom and dad got divorced, and we moved to Florida, where my mother's half-sisters lived. While visiting my Aunt Caroline, who lived in a little town called Osprey, 15 miles outside of Sarasota, which is on the western coast of Florida, South Tampa, is where I saw a skunk ape. My mom and aunt were talking, so I decided to walk through the nature because I love it. I headed for a wooded area. I had to cross a cow pasture to get to the woods. About halfway across the pasture is when I saw this hairy man. It was standing next to a palmetto bush, just staring at me. That is all I remember, because the next thing I know, I'm walking on the street in front of my mom's house. I never told anyone until years later. Again, In my 20s, at my dad's house in Michigan, there was a summer of strange events. Something was breathing outside my window, so loud it woke me up out of a sound sleep. My stepmother confided in me that she saw a tall, hairy man run across the backyard at night. My dad had two different events where something was making a high-pitched noise and slapped against the side of the trailer. My uncle, who lived across the street, said one night he heard what sounded like a grown man wrestling in the woods behind the house. During this time, one of my elders had asked my dad if he had a couple of friends who could build a sweat lodge on the 15 acres that my dad owns. My dad said yes. So they came out to do the ceremony. It was a year later, and they hadn't built the lodge, so I went to the elders and asked if something was wrong. One of them said it just didn't feel right. I decided to tell them about my weird experiences, which had stopped after they did the ceremony on my dad's land. They all said that it was Unchi, which meant Bigfoot. They explained, he shows up when things are out of balance to remind people to live in a good way, to restore balance later. I learned about putting down tobacco when entering the woods in their territory and asking permission to pass through. It is said that they will guide you and protect you, and although you will not know they are there usually. The Bigfoot is also known as Kitty Sabe, and is taught that they brought honesty to the people.